At 55 years old, Richard Rawlings has finally said what fans had been waiting years to hear. The end of Fast and Loud wasn't something Discovery decided behind closed doors. It was a choice he made himself. While viewers debated theories online, the real story was buried under contract clauses, creative exhaustion, and personal pressures that quietly shaped every move he made. The question was never whether he got pushed out. The question was whether he had simply grown too big for the frame the show had built around him. Richard Rawlings doesn't beat around the bush, and when he finally addressed the fate of Fast and Loud, he left nothing open to interpretation. For years, the fan community had been split between competing theories. A secret cancellation, a ratings collapse, a backstage feud that got out of hand. Rawlings shut all of it down. The show was over, the call had been his, and no amount of fan petitions or nostalgic goodwill was going to bring back a hidden season. He had walked away on his own terms, not because a network executive had shown him the door. What made that admission so striking was the scale of what he was walking away from. Fast and Loud had run for the better part of a decade, broadcast across more than 200 countries, and transformed a Dallas garage into a globally recognized brand. Choosing to end something at that level of reach didn't make obvious sense, until he explained the feeling behind it. After nearly 8 years of hunting forgotten cars, thrashing through builds under punishing deadlines, and delivering reveal after polished reveal, he had stopped feeling challenged. The formula that made the show a hit had quietly become a trap. For someone wired for risk and hungry for reinvention, running the same playbook every week felt less like success and more like standing still. The restrictions went deeper than creative repetition. One of the most revealing things Rawlings disclosed was a specific clause buried in his Discovery contract, a financial penalty of up to $25,000 per incident if he said anything negative about the network publicly. That wasn't a vague legal warning. It was a real, enforceable consequence that followed him into every interview, every social media post, every off-the-cuff comment. When rumors flared up about feuds and production drama, he couldn't correct the record. When speculation ran wild on fan forums, silence was the only legally safe response. The very thing fans read as evasiveness was actually the contract doing exactly what it was designed to do. The world around the show was also changing in ways that made the restrictions feel even tighter. When Fast and Loud launched in 2012, social media was still finding its footing. By the time the show wound down, YouTube and Instagram had become the central nervous system of car culture. Rawlings couldn't tap into that shift freely. Sharing a late-night build moment, documenting an unexpected breakdown, or just posting an unfiltered reaction required going through network approval first. The spontaneity that makes car content feel alive was being filtered out before it ever reached fans. That gap between what was happening in the garage and what audiences were actually seeing grew wider every season. So he made his move. He liquidated 28 vehicles from his personal collection, generating over $1 million. Not as a sign of retreat, but as fuel for a different direction. He wanted cars that excited him personally, not cars chosen because they tested well with audiences. He built out Gas Monkey's digital presence, launched a YouTube channel that crossed 1 million subscribers, and began refreshing his crew with new mechanics. From the outside it looked like an ending. From where he was standing it was the first real reset in years. And when fans asked whether Discovery might one day bring the show back with a new deal, his answer was a flat no. The door wasn't cracked. It was closed. Freedom sounds romantic until you tally up what it costs to get there. For Rawlings, the Discovery contract didn't just restrict what he could say. It throttled the pace at which he could create. The clearest example was a planned crossover with Chip Foose, one of the most respected builders in the business. On paper it was an obvious win. In practice, it spent 5 years trapped in network approvals before it ever made it to air. By the time the episode finally ran, the energy that should have made it electric had long since faded. The collaboration wasn't a disaster, but it was a shadow of what it could have been if it had happened at the speed of an actual idea rather than the speed of institutional caution. That pattern infected the show more broadly. Episodes settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly predictable. The builds, the conflicts, the reveals. All of it followed a groove that had been worn smooth by repetition. Rawlings knew how to work within that groove, but knowing how to do something and finding it meaningful are very different things. Television demanded performance as much as craftsmanship, and the line between building a car and staging a build had blurred almost beyond recognition. The authenticity that originally defined Gas Monkey Garage was getting edited down to fit a primetime slot. Social media made the gap feel even more glaring. Under the terms of his contract, Rawlings couldn't share his work freely. The late-night moments, the failed attempts, the raw frustration of a build going sideways, the content that fans of digital car culture actually crave, was either held back or processed through the slow machinery of network scheduling. Instead of speaking directly to the people who followed him, he was delivering polished dispatches that had been cleared, shaped, and timed by someone else's calendar. Fans still watched, but something felt missing. The garage seemed further away than it used to. The "Speak No Evil" clause made all of this harder to process publicly. At $25,000 per infraction, criticizing Discovery wasn't a risk Rawlings could afford to take lightly. That meant absorbing creative friction in silence, watching speculation spiral online without being able to address it, and keeping a lid on frustrations that would have been completely normal to express in any other professional context. Discovery wasn't acting as a villain, it was protecting its brand, which is what networks do. But for Rawlings, the practical effect was a muzzle, and muzzles breed exactly the kind of rumor and suspicion the clause was meant to prevent. The irony was that the audience had always responded most strongly to rawness. The moments fans remembered and rewatched weren't the flawless reveals. They were the breakdowns, the near misses, the builds that almost didn't make it. But those moments are messy, and messy content doesn't always survive the translation into a tightly produced 44-minute episode. On YouTube, the calculus is completely reversed. The mess isn't a problem to be edited around. It's the reason people tune in. A blown deadline or a smoking test drive doesn't kill the story. It becomes the story. That's the environment Rawlings was hungry to work in, and stepping away from Discovery was the only way to get there. The decision to sell off 28 cars was part of the same logic. It wasn't a liquidation, it was a recalibration. Clearing out vehicles he had accumulated for the show freed him up to chase the builds he had always wanted to tackle personally. Rarer machines, more demanding projects, cars that would push the garage in new directions rather than confirm what it already knew how to do. He wasn't shrinking Gas Monkey. He was pointing it somewhere new. The pressures that eventually ended Fast and Loud didn't only play out between Rawlings and the network. Inside the garage they left marks too. The most significant departure was Aaron Kaufman, the technically gifted builder who had served as a quiet counterweight to Rawlings' high-energy personality. Kaufman wasn't just skilled. He was the reason serious gearheads took the show seriously. He could get deep into a build in a way that gave Gas Monkey genuine credibility among people who cared about the craft above everything else. When he left, the show didn't collapse, but it changed in ways that were immediately noticeable. Kaufman himself explained that television's relentless production schedule had turned building from something he loved into something that felt like a grind. The deadlines were suffocating the craft, and he wasn't willing to keep sacrificing one for the other. Tom Smith and Jordan Butler followed him out, though for different reasons. Their exit came after a reported confrontation involving a fan with cystic fibrosis who had come to the garage hoping to photograph one of the Gas Monkey cars. According to accounts of the incident, Rawlings had the fan removed from the vehicle using profanity rather than offering a warmer reception. For Smith and Butler, that was the moment they had seen enough. They walked out in protest, and the fallout ultimately led them to Misfit Garage, a spin-off that was built directly around the division their departure had created. These exits weren't just personnel changes. They were symptoms of a larger strain. Gas Monkey had expanded well beyond the garage by then, branching into bars, live event venues, branded beverages, and merchandise. Every disagreement inside the shop now carried the weight of a much larger empire. Arguments that might once have been quickly resolved became flashpoints with higher stakes attached, because protecting the business meant everything had to be managed more carefully, more publicly, and with cameras running. The line between genuine conflict and produced drama became almost impossible to find. And in that environment, trust was usually the first thing to go. It would be too simple to frame all of this as the result of bad intentions. The more accurate explanation is pressure, relentless, compounding pressure to deliver content, grow the brand, and keep a complicated operation running smoothly under constant scrutiny. Pressure can push people to sharpen their skills, but it can also drive wedges between them that don't close easily. By the time Rawlings confirmed at 55 that Fast and Loud had run its course, it read less like a man quitting and more like a man choosing to protect what the garage had originally stood for before the weight of the machine got too heavy to carry. Scaling a garage into a lifestyle brand looks like a win until the brand starts attracting the wrong kind of attention. Gas Monkey's expansion into bars, restaurants, and live venues brought exposure that the original show never had to manage. The Gas Monkey Bar and Grill became the source of serious headlines when investigators alleged that premium liquor was being swapped out for cheaper alternatives. A scandal that had nothing to do with cars but everything to do with the name above the door. Stories like that travel fast, and they tend to cling to whoever's face is most associated with the brand. For Rawlings, who had built his entire public identity on being straight-talking and genuine, having the Gas Monkey name tangled in a liquor-swapping controversy was a particularly damaging kind of blow. Legal battles added further complications. The Gas Monkey logo, which Rawlings had always treated as something deeply personal rather than just a commercial asset, ended up at the center of heated disputes over licensing and brand control. The filings were adversarial on all sides, and the public nature of the conflict made it impossible to manage quietly. For Rawlings, it wasn't about the money. It was about people trying to trade on something he had built from scratch without his permission. His response, selling off parts of the collection and restructuring his relationship with various brand extensions, looked from the outside like someone stepping back. From his perspective, it was triage, cutting away what had become infected before it damaged the core. The show itself wasn't immune to credibility problems. The so-called Shart Cat build, a modified Dodge Dart, became a flashpoint for criticism when it became clear that the timeline presented on screen bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. The car's computer systems had required a full overhaul handled by outside specialists at Diablo Sport, a process that took far longer than any viewer would have guessed from the final edit. Gearheads watching at home caught the discrepancy and called it out loudly. For casual fans it didn't much matter, but for the audience that took the craft seriously, it confirmed a suspicion that the show's dramatic timelines were being shaped more by television logic than by what actually happens in a real shop. Taken together, the bar controversy, the trademark disputes, the editing criticism, the picture that emerged was of a brand that had been stretched in too many directions at once, each extension pulling it further from the authenticity that had made it worth following in the first place. Rawlings, now on the other side of all of it, didn't flinch from acknowledging the weight. What he chose to do with that acknowledgement was tell the truth, simplify the operation, and shift to a format where the messy reality of building cars didn't have to be cleaned up before anyone could see it. Rawlings made his position on a Fast and Loud comeback about as clear as a position can be made. There was no hedging, no door left open for future negotiation, no hint that the right offer might change his mind. The show is finished. Not paused, not on hold, not waiting for the right moment to return. Finished. For fans who had spent years hoping the show might somehow find its way back to air, that finality stung. But for Rawlings, having no ambiguity left to manage was actually a relief. He no longer had to measure his words around the possibility of a return. He could focus entirely on what came next. What came next turned out to be a direct line between the garage and the audience. His YouTube channel became the vehicle for a different kind of storytelling. No premiere dates to wait for, no episode arcs carefully constructed for network approval, no edits shaped around commercial breaks. Just the garage, the builds, and the people watching them unfold in something close to real time. The channel crossed 1 million subscribers and kept climbing, and the engagement looked different from what television had produced. Fans weren't just watching anymore. They were responding, commenting, and becoming part of an ongoing conversation rather than a passive audience waiting for the next broadcast. The hiring activity at Gas Monkey told the same story as the content shift. Rawlings wasn't winding down or coasting on what the show had built. He was bringing in new mechanics, new personalities, and new energy specifically to take on harder, more ambitious projects. That kind of investment doesn't make sense for someone looking to maintain a legacy. It makes sense for someone who has something new to prove. The car collection reshuffle completed the picture. Trading 28 vehicles for over $1 million wasn't a liquidation event. It was a deliberate repositioning. Rawlings said plainly that he wanted different cars, better cars, the kinds of builds he had always wanted to take on but never quite had the freedom to pursue on his own terms. European rarities, technically demanding restorations, machines that rewarded patience and skill rather than speed and dramatic presentation. Those are the builds that make for genuinely unpredictable content. And unpredictable content is exactly what plays best on a platform where audiences have chosen to spend their time rather than just happen to have the TV on. On a personal level, the contract clause that had quietly defined so much of his professional life for years was simply gone. No more $25,000 penalty waiting if he said the wrong thing about the network. No more carefully worded interviews or strategic silences. If he wanted to collaborate with a builder today, he could make a call, shake hands, and be in the shop by the weekend. The pace of how he now operates matches the pace of who he actually is. And for someone who spent years watching good ideas move at the speed of institutional approval, that freedom is not a small thing. If you want more deep dives like this, like the video, drop a comment on which build or moment we should break down next, and subscribe so you never miss a new story. And when you are done here, watch the next video on the screen. Another behind-the-scenes look at the machines, the moves, and the makers who shape car culture today.